Ahmad Ashara has an unusual resume. He was born in 1982 in Saudi Arabia, the son of a Syrian petroleum engineer and I believe an Arab nationalist, not an Islamist. His family returned to Syria in 1989. After the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, he joined Abu Musab al-Zarqawi's organization, al-Qaeda, in Iraq. Following the outbreak of the Syrian civil war in 2011, he established al-Qaeda's branch in Syria, Jabhat al-Nusra. In 2016, he severed ties with al-Qaeda, and al-Nusra evolved into Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS. In late 2024, HTS forces launched an offensive that culminated in the downfall of the Tehran-aligned regime of Bashar al-Assad. After that, al-Sharaa became what he is now, interim president of Syria. The U.S. rescinded its terrorist designation of HTS and lifted a $10 million bounty previously placed on Ashara's head. Last week, wearing a blue suit, white shirt, and red tie, he became the first Syrian leader in decades to address the General Assembly. I think he was also the first al-Qaeda alumnus to address the UN. To discuss what he said and how we should evaluate him in his new role, we're joined by FDD Vice President of Research David Adesnik and FDD Research Analyst Ahmad Sharawi. I'm Cliff May, and I'm pleased you're with us too here on Foreign Policy. Gentlemen, good to see you both.
Good to be back.
Thank you for having me.
Ahmad, let me start with you. Did I summarize his biography adequately?
Yes, you did. So Shara moved to, he moved to Iraq before the fall of the Saddam Hussein regime, and then he quickly, after that, in 2004, he went back to Syria, got imprisoned by Assad, and then returned and joined al-Qaeda and Abu Musab al-Zarqawi's branch there in Iraq. He was later arrested in 2005, if I remember correctly. He tried to plant an IED and he got arrested.
That was IED in front of American?
American against American troops, and he got arrested.
Yeah,
and he was put in several prisons. One of them was Camp Buka. He was also in Abu Ghraib, if I remember correctly. And that's how he became, I guess, well known within that Islamist jihadist movement. He was teaching inmates Arabic, and as soon as he left in 2011, he had a lot of fans inside the prison. One of them was Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS.
And just when you say he was teaching Arabic, why did they not speak Arabic in this prison? Who was there that didn't speak Arabic?
They all spoke Arabic, but it was more of like grammatical lessons of Arabic.
I see.
Modern standard Arabic rather than dialects.
And that's an important point, that his father, as I mentioned, was an engineer. He was from a very well-educated and prosperous family. They lived in a ritzy neighborhood of Damascus when they lived there. Start with this, and then I'll ask you the same question. Do you have the sense that he is that at heart he is a true Islamist, the jihadist? That this is ideological, or more importantly, theological for him, or what's your sense of his motivations? I know you're kind of asking to speculate, but
so based on the things I've read and heard. Is that compared to his siblings, Shara used to go to the mosque frequently. Even his wardrobe was different. He wore a white tunic. He was, I guess, I would say he was more religious than the rest of his family.
Definitely.
I mean, as you stated, his father was an Arab nationalist, and I was watching a podcast of his father for 3 hours.
Wow.
He gave a podcast 2 weeks ago, and
his father did.
Yes,
2 weeks ago, 3-hour podcast.
Yep.
I'm glad you're doing this. It's not something I'm going to do, but
and so he spoke a lot about the family's history and the upbringing, and it's distinct. I mean, if you compare the trajectory between Shara and his brothers, one of them is married to a Russian, and there's a businessman. The other was the manager of Pepsi in Erbil in Iraq. So very different trajectories, but
The father's proud of him now, no doubt.
Well, as president, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, who wouldn't be proud of his son if they were president?
You want to weigh in on who this guy is? You've been studying him a long time.
Well, first I'll say that I think there's quite a few parents out there who are willing to talk about their kids for 3 hours. That's not all that unusual.
I could do it.
And also, I mean, in terms of being, is he proud of him? I think he'd be prouder if he was a doctor. I mean, we know that about parents. It's always better to be a doctor. But, you asked, what are his real motivations, right? If you were asking this 12 months ago, it would be a much easier question to answer, right? Someone who had been involved for 20 years in jihadist activities, was part of, some of the most hardline groups employing violence to create a state ruled by Sharia law. And then he, even on the road to Damascus, he didn't have a conversion on the road because he was interviewed by CNN actually in those that rapid period when he was advancing with his troops, and he still said they asked him, are you still in favor of strict Islamic rule? And he said, well, people who object to that don't really understand it. But since taking power, even a few days after that, he has been remarkably disciplined in saying nothing to suggest he's an Islamist. And it's easy to say that, well, he could be suppressing it. He's a very savvy leader, and he understands that would be too detrimental. But the thing is, we've seen very few truly committed Islamist leaders who are capable of keeping it down when asked about it, especially if they're successful enough to take the lead of their country. I mean, the Taliban would occasionally try to feign a degree of friendship or openness, but it's only a matter of days before they're back to their thunderous denunciation. Same with the Islamic Republic of Iran. So, I'm really divided on this question because I don't know how you can spend that many years, waging jihad against the United States and other, and its imperialist allies, and then suddenly turn around almost within days or weeks and become someone totally different. On the other hand, he's behaving in a way that I really can't think of any other extremist leader who sort of left that behind so quickly without ever sort of relapsing into extremist language.
Before we get to what he had to say when he went to the UN General Assembly, let's talk a little bit about, let's have you update us on the kind of the situation inside Syria at this point. First of all, I guess, to what extent does he and do his forces exercise control?
Well, he really only controls a part of Syria, and I guess it's roughly the part that Assad controlled before he was overthrown. So
that's Damascus and...
Yeah, so if you think of Syria, you could sort of think of it as a string of fairly densely populated cities running north to south, not too far in from the Mediterranean coast. And then as you go further east, there's a fairly large hinterland, a ton of just unpopulated desert, but also some other areas that are, more sparsely populated. And so in the northeast, right, that's where the U.S.-led coalition was fighting the Islamic State, where our main partners were a group of Syrian Kurds, and they effectively govern that area, which is around 30% of Syria's landmass, also key agricultural area and the source of almost all the oil.
So it's not a heavily populated area, but it's an important area economically that the Kurds control. That quarter or third.
And remember, it's not just a Kurdish area. I mean, it is. Okay. There's a Kurdish population. There's also an Arab population there. So that is a potential cause of tension.
And it's Arab Sunni who's there as well.
Yes, yeah. There are very few Shiites.
Yeah. Well, we're going to talk about that, but there are Alawites, and when we talk about what they are. But okay, but that's on the coastal area. That's very different. And the Arabs and the Kurds in the Kurdish-controlled area, they basically get along?
A lot of it is, I think, because there's a U.S. presence sort of in the background, right? Not many troops, but our political authority, our ability.
And I want you to say a few words, both of you, about the U.S. presence there, what it does, why I think it's important, why I think you think it's important. Some people don't. Talk a little bit about the U.S. presence. It's a very small presence.
Yes,
but it's a very impactful presence.
Yeah, I mean, so the new model of fighting insurgencies that sort of emerged in response to the Islamic State, I think people were thinking about it before, but it's the indirect approach. We want to give the unique capabilities the U.S. has in terms of air power, surveillance, intelligence, and then find partners on the ground who can do some of the really rough fighting. It doesn't sound like a great bargain for the partner, but the Kurds were fighting for their lives. The Islamic State wanted to wipe them out. So a partnership with the U.S. was not such a bad proposition, and they lost thousands and thousands of men in that fight. It's ultimately gotten more secure, but the Islamic State is far from gone. Actually, Assad did a fairly poor job of keeping it under control. It wasn't his priority.
Right.
They weren't the real threat to the regime. It's more, others further west are the threat.
By the way, al-Shara's group, al-Nusra, did fight the Islamic State, not because al-Nusra was moderate, but because they were competitors in the sort of the same field. Is that a fair way to say that?
Absolutely. So just to go back into the background for a bit, when Shara moved to Syria to establish al-Nusra, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi then sent ISIS a year after in 2013 in order to form a Syrian branch and asked Shara, who at that time was al-Julani, to integrate into ISIS. And that's how the rivalry started, and that's how the clashes started.
Al-Julani, that was his nom de guerre,
exactly. Abu Mohammad
and it means person from the Golan Heights, which he's not.
He is actually.
He is. He was born in
not him, but I mean his family.
But some of his family.
His father was born
in the Syrian Golan.
In the Syrian Golan.
Got it. I think I need to sort of finish off the answer for you.
I'm sorry.
Why are American troops there? Why
please. No,
right. So even after the dismantling of the caliphate, so it didn't really control territory of its own, it's retreating into the background in both Syria and in Iraq. And you need a continued force to handle it. Again, it's not many Americans. We really maintained only around 900 troops there until actually around the time Assad fell. We briefly doubled it to around 2,000. But the thing is, we still have this air power, there's intelligence and other things, and the Kurds need our backup, right? Even with their numbers being, pretty savvy, tough combat fighters, it will be much harder for them to take on, even the remnants of the Islamic State without our support. So what we're doing is we're keeping a place fairly stable with a minimum commitment. And, there's been a few minor incidents, but the casualties every soldier lost is terrible, especially, for that soldier's family, but it's been around, a dozen troops that we've done this mission.
Yeah. And there's just a couple other things to note about this. One is that at one point, Russian forces, probably Wagner forces, not self-identified Russian forces, attacked the Americans there, and the Americans wiped out those Russian forces, and Putin kept his mouth shut. I got that right?
Yeah, it was pretty crazy in the sense that there were these initial reports of a clash. I think because the Americans were also in a position where even if their focus was fighting the Islamic State, just the fact that they were there made life less convenient for the Russians, for Assad, and for their partners and the Iranians, right? Because you couldn't push weapons through as easily.
Right. Just to be understand, Assad was aligned with both Tehran and with Moscow simultaneously. Those were his patrons.
Yeah. And as we see now, right, Iranians providing drones for Russia providing things back. They're, part of this emerging axis of aggressors.
For sure.
So if anyone's surprised, hopefully the surprise is wearing off.
And one more thing I got to do on this, and that is the Turks have been saying, and there are those that think tanks with which we have we're kind of mostly aligned, would say, well, the problem with the Kurds with whom the Americans have made common cause in Syria is that they're essentially part of a terrorist or anti-Turkish terrorist organization. Now, Americans who have fought with them would say, these guys had my back. I trusted them. They trusted me. We worked together hand in glove. They're not terrorists. You might want to enlighten people on this because this is a controversy among, I would say, more hawkish think tanks.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a controversy. And because the reality is messy. Right. So the Turkish group you're talking about is the PKK, a Kurdish insurgent group designated by the U.S. as a terrorist organization, been fighting the Turkish government for decades. The Syrian Kurds, the group we are partnered with, really the YPG, is effectively the Syrian offshoot of that terrorist group. And there's a constant debate about how, independent it is. And basically, we wanted to reinforce something of a firewall. It's not a real, it's not impermeable. Many of, the Kurds, they're, in contiguous areas in Turkey, Iraq, Iran, and Syria. And so the people move around. It's not like you could say this is, purely the Syrian branch. We've gotten rid of every Turkish Kurd and every Iranian Kurd and every Iraqi Kurd. So there's mixing, but it seems that their conduct has been quite restrained. That, the Erdogan's government in Turkey keeps accusing them, they're supporting the guys inside Turkey, but we don't have signs of attacks launched across the border. They seem to understand that the help they're getting from Americans depends on them not using America's help as a sort of a backdoor to get at Turkey.
Do I remember incorrectly also, hasn't the PKK, the group in Turkey, in eastern Turkey, which is Kurdish lands, I would say, but all right, also kind of backed off in terms of their hostilities towards the Turkish government?
Yeah, there's been, actually Erdogan was one of the first to really engage in substantial peace talks with them. It didn't work out in the end, and there's been new moves in that direction. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that at all, Ahmad.
So there's been an ongoing peace process between Erdogan and Abdullah Öcalan, the leader of the PKK.
Is he in jail?
Yes, he is.
Okay, but he's been talking peace from jail. Okay.
Yes, and so they called to disarm. I think it was around February, March of this year. However, the SDF announced that they won't be part of this disarmament, and that in their case, they won't be following the PKK's orders of disarming. So that's another issue between Turkey, the SDF, as well as the Syrian government, who has been calling for the SDF's integration into the Syrian armed forces, as well as to integrate into the Syrian state.
This question, I've known Iraqi Kurds for many years. Mm-hmm. Look, what they have sort of said is privately, we'd rather be our own country. But if we are going to be part of Iraq, and if we're treated with respect, and we have a reasonable degree of autonomy for our culture, our language, our approach to religion, okay, we can accept that. Would you say the same is true of the Kurds in Syria? That okay, we'll be part of Syria if we get to live as Kurds here?
Yeah, I think that they actually had a pretty good history of cooperating with Damascus before the war, before the Syrian civil war that began in 2011, and in fact, in early parts of that war, it seems to be that Assad was fairly comfortable with them exerting a fair amount of autonomy because he had to focus on fighting enemies closer to the capital. Right. So historically, they're not nearly, they don't have the same kind of precedent of independence as the Iraqi Kurds, who even despite that precedent have reconciled themselves to being, in a state led by Baghdad. And a second factor is there's a limited leverage that, if the U.S. says we are committed to a single Syrian state and not breaking it up, it would be very hard for the Syrian Kurds to say no.
Most listeners will know this, but I just want to make sure they do. The various lands that someone like me might call Kurdish lands are all contiguous.
Yeah, effectively. They're maybe little pockets, but it's basically you could draw a circle that takes in contiguous parts of Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria, and it's the Kurdish area.
Right. Okay. All right. Let's go to the Druze, because my understanding is that what the Druze have suffered since the takeover, since the fall of Assad, has been pretty much equivalent to what the Israelis suffered on October 7th, 2023. Am I going too far to say that?
Well, some of the reports we have, and I'll expand after this, it really is something similar, rampages through towns where, there's one story that was reported by Reuters and verified that they asked an old man, 60 years old, are you, Muslim or Druze? And when he answered Druze, they shot him dead. So that kind of, and you should point out the Alawites as well, right? These are the two major
I want to talk about all these.
Right.
This is an important point about Syria. Maybe we should back up with this. When we talk about Syria, it's easy to think, this country has been around for 1,000 years. No, it hasn't been. There are various populations there. Sunni, Alawite, Druze, Christians, Kurds, and a line was drawn around them, and then we said, okay, now we got a country called Syria.
Yeah, there was never really a Syria historically before World War I.
There was Damascus, and that was a great capital of Islamic empires and all of that, and there was Aleppo, which was a great mercantile capital, and all that. But so suddenly these peoples who are very different are part of one country. That's I would say that is the main reason why the Assad regime came into power, because Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafez al-Assad, right?
Yeah.
I think he figured if we, the Alawites, a minority, we can talk about who they are in a minute, if we're not in control, if we're not serving dinner, we're going to be served for dinner. We better be in control, or we're going to get kicked in the head. I'll say that nicely.
Well, I'll just give it a slight twist on that,
go ahead.
Which is that they weren't necessarily for dinner. They wouldn't, the state, others weren't preying on them, but they were a poor, poorly educated, rural group that was not benefiting from the modernization of the state. But as a certain set of young men in that community looked for better opportunities, like Hafez al-Assad, they often became military officers. And so what you began to see was a really disproportionate number of Alawite military officers. And then as there was a series of coups, competitions within the military, it became increasingly smart for them to rely only on their sort of Alawite whether you call it co-ethnic, co-religion. It's a hard, it's not even clear whether it should be called an ethnicity or a religion. Regardless, they knew who their team was. It wasn't, they weren't locking other people out systematically. There were Sunni Arabs in this regime. There were Druze, every Christians, but the core was Alawite.
The core was
and then it became, they controlled the state.
One more thing about the Alawites to go back to the Jews, and see if you agree with me. So the Alawites are, it is not unfair to say Alawites are sort of a branch of Shiism, but I think if they were located in Iran, they'd be seen as heretics. I think the only reason they're not seen as heretics is because Bashar al-Assad was willing to be the satrap, the vassal, the governor, regent, whatever you want to call it, of the Iranian regime in Syria, because I mean their approach to religion, to Islam, is quite different, certainly, than that of the Khomeinyists in Tehran. Am I correct on that?
Absolutely. I mean, the Alawites became Shias
for convenience.
For convenience, but also after Hafez al-Assad asked Musa Sadr, one of the Shia leaders in Lebanon, and he gave him the blessing that you guys are Shias now.
Good enough.
But why did he ask for that? Because the Syrian constitution said that the president must be Muslim. And so it would have been unconstitutional if Hafez al-Assad became president. But at some point, he actually removed that principle. And that's when the Muslim Brotherhood started rioting in Syria. I mean, this is a very complicated story, but they basically got that religious or Islamic legitimacy through Musa Sadr because Hafez al-Assad asked him.
Okay. All right, back to the Druze. This is complex, all this stuff. All right, and so has that situation stabilized at all? Are we still seeing massacres and rapes and homes being burnt down in the Druze areas, when the Druze areas are in the south, not contiguous with Israel, but closer to Jordan? Yeah.
There's not been major reports. I don't know what you've seen on the lower end.
It's been, I guess, in terms of clashes, it's been relatively stable.
Who stabilized it, or what has stabilized it? Just burned itself out, or have there been, or as al-Sharaa, for example, al-Sharaa, I know the L and the S are supposed to cloak. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's written al-Sharaa, but it's pronounced Ashara, right? Has he done anything to try to protect the Jews, as the Israelis have insisted he must, or they will, right? And the Israelis have also attempted to help the Druze, I think, by supplying weapons and that sort of thing. Am I right on that?
Weapons and money. According to a Reuters report, of course, hasn't been confirmed. But since early August, the Ministry of Interior, so Shara's General Security Service, has been surrounding Suwaida.
Suwaida be that Druze area we're talking
Druze
about,
area,
right?
of course. But Suwaida city, and that's the biggest urban center within the province, is still controlled by Druze militias and armed factions. They've actually created their own centralized or local governance system, their own militia that unified multiple factions. But I mean, as of last week, there was a U.S. brokered plan in order to bring stability to Suwaida, which includes putting armed forces that are from the province but are still affiliated with the government. As in, we won't be seeing soldiers coming from Idlib. That's the area that Shara controlled prior to the campaign against Assad, or Damascus, or other areas in Syria, but locals from the area. The Druze, however, actually, and other provisions were holding those who committed atrocities accountable. One point about the Druze and the government in Damascus is that there's a lot of mistrust right now. And the Druze don't trust Shara or his government. And they've been asking for independence and autonomy for the past month and a half.
Independence. And I mean, there's a big difference between independence and autonomy, obviously.
Well, I mean, I would say the most extreme are calling for independence.
Okay.
Some are calling for autonomy.
And by the way, it's unusual for Druze to call for independence. Absolutely. Because they hold, under the Druze religion, you don't do what the Kurds do and say, we'd like our own country. You say, we will be good citizens of whatever country we're in if we possibly can be, right? And they're very, very loyal citizens of Israel, very important in the military and all of that. They've tried to be loyal in Lebanon. I think it's been more challenging and probably most challenging in Syria. And those are the main places, I guess, where the Druze are.
Yeah, but obviously civil wars make it very hard to know which side you're loyal to. But in both Lebanon and Syria, they have made that effort to be as loyal.
Yeah. So it's unusual to call for that. But all right, they'd probably settle for autonomy since as long as they can be safe, right?
Mm.
All right, maybe move on to the Christians now. The Christians have also gotten slammed pretty hard since Assad's fall. No,
there was one church bombing in June. That was it wasn't officially claimed by ISIS, but Shara's government has attributed the attack to ISIS. It was claimed by another offshoot group called Ansar al-Sunnah. We don't know a lot about the group, but Shara's government is blaming ISIS, or blamed ISIS for the attack.
Okay. And we talk about the Alawites, but what's their current situation? My impression is that they are trying to come to terms with Ashara, right? They're trying to find a way to do that. And again, they're in a coastal area mostly, and
for the Alawites, compared to the Druze, first of all, even though they're positioned in the Syrian coast, but they're not centralized in one certain area, like Suwaida, for example.
Yeah.
So you see small pockets of small villages throughout the coast.
Okay.
What's the current situation is the government has full control over the coast. There are two provinces, Tartus and Latakia. Unlike what we're seeing in Suwaida, where the government doesn't have control.
Okay.
I think the Alawites have been, again, they haven't been calling for independence or autonomy. There are some factions. There are remnants of the Assad regime, militias that are still loyal to him. It's less frequent now, but we've seen some clashes with the government forces, kidnapping of government forces, Alawite civilians getting kidnapped, women getting kidnapped. So it's still a mess.
You mentioned Tartus. There is a Russian naval base there.
Yes.
Is it still operating?
Yes.
Pretty much normally?
Yes.
Yeah.
There's been discussions between the government in Damascus and Russia about this, but it seems like the Russians are still operating in that area.
Yeah. And Shara has good reason to try to mend fences with the Russians. Obviously, they were the ones on Assad's side, bombing people relentlessly, bombing hospitals, really.
Well, there may be some, grievances over that.
Few grievances, but he needs them for something, which is to get himself off the UN terror blacklist.
I see.
Right. You want all 5 Security Council members.
All 5 Security Council members. So if Russia does that and the U.S. does that, China will go along with Russia. Yeah. France and Britain will go along. Yeah, okay.
Actually, the Chinese have been reluctant on removing him.
Why?
Because Shara integrated Uyghur forces into his army. The Turkestan Islamic Party, which is considered a terrorist organization by China and used to be a terrorist or a designated terrorist organization by the U.S., but it was delisted in 2020.
It actually should have stayed on our terror list. It was an error to remove it. Obviously, I think generally have a lot of sympathy for the Uyghurs as a people who have been subjected to near genocidal.
Well, the U.S. government considers it genocide, and just so everyone knows, again, people may be coming to this a little bit fresh, and that's okay. The Uyghurs are the people from what the Chinese call Xinjiang. If you look at a map, you'll see it's north of Tibet. You'll see that, and Xinjiang means new province. This is a part of the Chinese empire. It's not part of China. People will say that, but I don't think it is. It's if you're a Uyghur, you probably don't call yourself a Uyghur. You call yourself an East Turkestani from East Turkestan. You're much closer in terms of ethnicity, religion, culture to people in the Central Asian stands than I would say than you are to the Chinese, and the Chinese are kind of trying to. I think it's genocidal in the sense they're going to intermarry, they're going to make them speak Chinese, all that. The Uyghurs would come to Syria. Maybe al-Sharaa teaches them Arabic because that's not their native language. It's maybe their religious language, but it's not. But they speak a Turkish tongue.
Yep.
But this group, the Turkestan Islamic Party, right? They're basically al-Qaeda aligned, a part of al-Qaeda. The most recent information is their leader, Abdul Haq al-Turkestani, is part of the al-Qaeda Shura Council, meaning a truly senior al-Qaeda figure. So that's why I just want to make the point that while we should generally be sympathetic with the Uyghurs plight amid Chinese atrocities, it's not as if it was the good ones that wound up fighting with Ahmad al-Sharaa.
Well, I think it's basically true. You tell me that if you look anywhere in what we call the Islamic world, it's an odd phrase recently. Really, you're going to find in almost any place those who are very Islamist and very jihadi, and those who are not, and those who have a very different view of the world. And almost any country you go to. Now, there are some that are much more moderate than, Azerbaijan is Shia, but great friends with Israel, great friends with the U.S. It's a dictatorship. It's not a democracy. UAE is a country that features tolerance for sure. People don't have difficulty. Qatar, I think, is much more is Muslim Brotherhood. Turkey is much anyhow. So it's complicated to see, but it's not surprising that there are Uyghurs who want to see the restoration of a great Islamic caliphate dominating the world as they did for over 1,000 years.
Yep. And that's why all these foreign fighters came to Syria, because they saw a chance in achieving that. Yeah,
right. All right. You and John Chanja have a piece in the National Interest. I'm just going to read a sentence because it's important. Since the downfall of the Assad regime, the new leadership in Damascus has been reluctant to grant the Muslim Brotherhood an opening in the evolving political system. Local Syrian media sources indicate that Shara informed the Brotherhood's general controller, Amir Busalama, of the government's intention to freeze the group's activities. Worth elaborating on that. That's interesting that he's going to even stop the Muslim Brotherhood, which I kind of think of, and again, correct me if you guys think I'm wrong, sort of the gateway drug to all forms of Islamism and jihadism.
Absolutely. The Muslim Brotherhood in Syria has had a very turbulent history throughout the years. First of all, they were banned in the 60s, massacred in the 80s, and they didn't play an active role during the Syrian civil war, but they still have some sort of legitimacy with the Syrians outside of Syria, Syrians in exile. Shara might be an Islamist, but bringing back the Muslim Brotherhood and giving them the path towards being part of the political process means that he will be creating a new political rival that might confront him in the future. And so sidelining them, despite the similar ideology, or even if he agrees with them, this is purely a pragmatic move, or a move to sideline a potential rival that might threaten his power over Syria, rather than a change in ideology. And so he's been very reluctant in giving them a chance to come back to Syria, even though a lot of people thought that they might come back. Again, as I stated, they were the main political party or opposition political party during the Hafiz al-Assad regime, the days of the Hafiz al-Assad regime. And people assumed that with the return of Ahmad al-Sharaa and the removal of the Assad regime and the Ba'athist and the pan-Arabist and the Ba'athist political system, that this will open a way for the Muslim Brotherhood with its strong foundations and capabilities to return back to the Syrian arena. But again, Shara is not doing this because he's not an Islamist. He's doing this just to preserve his own control over power.
And you mentioned the Ba'athists, and just so people know, Ba'athism was sort of secular, socialist, a little fascist, Arab nationalist. The benefits it had for, say, if you were an Arab Christian, is you could be part of that movement in a way you couldn't be part of an Islamist movement. maybe the same is true of an Alawite. At one point, both Syria and Iraq were Baathists, but I don't think their ideologies were by any means identical and didn't like each other.
They hated each other.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I mean, they fell apart on who gets to define the real Baath.
Who gets the real Baath?
So in theory, there's a single Baath party for the entire Arab world, and each country was actually referred to as like a region.
Yep.
Right, so you'd say the Syrian region, the Iraqi region of the Arabs, the Baaths.
Well, this was pan-Arabism,
right? It was really,
and then you get
serious.
And if you think about it, when pan-Arabism failed as a movement, pan-Islamism reemerged to take its place. Not that that's a new movement exactly, but that's essentially what happened, right? As you point out, Shara's father he liked Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt, who was a pan-Arabist.
Yes.
Right, yeah. All right, interesting. All right, in a way, Shara is sort of like that TV reality series The Bachelor, because he's got a lot.
I'm waiting to hear this.
Well, think of the courtships. I mean, right? I mean, Turkey is his key sponsor. He's got the Qataris, who are Muslim Brotherhood. They probably may be disappointed, but they're also saying, we have a lot of money, we can help you. When President Trump met with Shara, he met with him in Riyadh. The Saudis are also saying, you want our help? Well, you don't want to get in bed with the Muslim Brotherhood because we think we've banned the Muslim Brotherhood, so you don't want to do that. The Minorities they don't always get along with the Saudis, but they're saying we don't like them either. You got the Americans saying we can be helpful to you, but you can't be a jihadist and expect us to help you. But so that's why he's got all these courtiers, right?
Yeah, and don't forget the Europeans, because he can offer them something very important, which is the hope that they can send refugees home. Same with Erdogan as well, of course. But
and Erdogan, he's got like 3 million Syrians in Turkey, which he would like to send
absolutely. There's, the real Turkish backlash against hosting the refugees. It even, becomes racist and bigoted at a certain point. You can see.
So, if Shara is smart, he can say, okay, and I think he is. I'm going to play off these various suitors and get the most of what I want. And then he has to think, and again, who knows, what exactly do I want? One thing is, if you're a realist, you have to say, what can I do? And I'm not going to, for example, one of the things the Israelis did after the fall of Assad was to see to it that Assad's successor would not have huge military resources. Right? And so you can say, okay, I don't have that now. So maybe it's a bad idea for me to go to war with Israel. Maybe I should do something else. Maybe he really wants to do something else, like repair, have a reasonable economy. And it's not impossible. Not impossible. I don't know. On the other hand, the Turks want certain things. I kind of think that the Turks, I think Erdogan is a neo-Ottoman and sees the Islamic regime in Tehran as a competitor.
Well, it's important to remember, actually, that Turkey occupies effectively part of Syria, right? So during the Civil War, they sponsored Syrian forces, which eventually they formed into what they call the Syrian National Army. And basically areas adjacent to the Turkish border basically became governed almost as an extension of Turkey. They were using, the Turkish lira as their currency. And there's now actually quite a flow economically that, Idlib, where Shara was, it wasn't under Turkish control, but adjacent to the border. And you see Turkish goods, flowing through there now. So Turkey has a lot of influence, but I think there's still a tension where, Erdogan may hope that Shara can become his protege or, see him as the Sultan and Shara merely the provincial governor. It's not clear that Shara would reconcile himself to that.
Especially if he doesn't have to, especially if he's getting support from, say, the Saudis, who can provide quite a lot of support.
Ahmad has actually published a piece along with one of our colleagues, Natalie Akano, talking about the various multi-billion-dollar deals that the various Gulf states have made with Shara for investment.
But it depends which Gulf state. Again, Qatar is very different from
Saudi Arabia,
Emirates,
of course.
Yeah.
They're all bidding, right?
But they're all bidding. Well, that's why I say they're kind of like suitors for the match.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing a competition between the Saudis and the Qataris,
particularly.
But we're also seeing cooperation between both of them.
Really?
Yes.
So yesterday, what do they have? What do they both want? What's their common goal?
All they talk about is we're trying to secure a stable Syria.
Okay.
But the question here is, when will they diverge? When will they stop cooperating and start competing.
Got it. And maybe say a few words about where Israel is with Ashara at this point. My impression is they'd love to make a deal. They want to make a deal. They don't trust him, but they're willing to verify.
This is one of the sort of the most shocking developments in a way, right? So no matter how practical certain Arab leaders have been through history, the ability to then say, and I'm going to get along reasonably well with Israel is not an easy thing for any of them to say, either because they
and especially
feel
now.
the hatred.
Especially now.
Right. Especially now amid the Gaza war. And obviously you have the couple cases of the Saudis and the Emiratis that are, on better terms with the Israelis, but that was a long time in coming. So the idea that an Islamist, an al-Qaeda veteran comes to power and sort of responds fairly passively to Israeli airstrikes all over his country, as
including in Damascus.
Right, in Damascus. Even hitting the defense ministry at one of their buildings. And even they took additional land in the Golan. I mean, they say it's temporary. So after all these things, it will be so easy to seize on them and to start banging a nationalist drum and say, Syrians rally to me. I'm going to defend us from, the Israeli enemy you've all been raised to hate under 50 years of Assad rule. He doesn't do this. He makes very understated comments, or you saw it in the UN at his speech. He condemned some of what Israel's doing. You can only call it virtue signaling the way he said, I support Gaza. It was, I'm sure a lot of people on the other side would say this is the most hollow commitment ever. He says he is, supports Gaza, but he's sitting down. He's having his foreign minister meet Ron Dermer, Netanyahu's key advisor, and they're supposedly very close to a security agreement. So that turnaround is one of the most shocking.
Talk about his speech a little bit more. What else did he say? How was his delivery? I mean, everyone was talking about Trump and what he had to say and how the escalator failed on him and his teleprompter, all that stuff worked for Ashara.
Well, it looked like Shara was reading off paper, not a teleprompter.
Well, so was Trump at the end of the day.
I mean, I think he was his usual sort of calm, measured self. In general, it leaned toward being a nothing burger, right? He knew he had this audience that loved him. All he had to do was talk about the triumph of good over evil in Syria, the bad, truly, literally bad, awful, murderous regime is gone, and he has replaced it. The only part that seemed to me like he was crossing into a fair amount of spin is when he talked about sort of treatment of minorities. He really glossed over the fact that there had been these 2 murder sprees, each resulting in at least 1,000 deaths, if not more. And then he hasn't held anyone accountable. And that's one of the biggest things when we get to it. He's expressed contrition. He's condemned the violence. But it leaves us with this big question. Is it that he actually doesn't want to hold anyone accountable? Or is it that maybe all the Islamists under him, all the jihadis who came to town with him are not really so bought in to his vision of a more tolerant Syria, at least that he's projecting, that they're willing to see some of their own guys go to jail for killing the pigs and dogs, as they would call as they've called the Druze and the Alawites.
Go ahead. Yeah. Anything else that struck you in his speech?
I think he tried to really play on that sentiment that with the fall of the Assad regime, Syria's 60-year alienation from the international community is over, and that he's basically asking the international community to support the Syrians and bring them back to the international fold. Whether it was, he said that Syria is now open for global investments and asked for sanctions relief. So, and I expected this. I thought he's going to focus more on what the world can do for Syria in terms of investments and how they can help rebuild and help in reconstruction and rebuilding. All the ruins after 14 years of civil war.
Yeah, and the country is. One shouldn't underestimate how bad the country has been rubbled. Places like Aleppo.
Yes.
Really, seriously, if you're going to get back to a decent standard of living, there's a lot that needs to be done.
They need $400 billion to rebuild the whole thing.
Yeah. Is there any Jewish community left in Syria? There was a Jewish, very vibrant Jewish community. A lot of them are in America. Some of them are very pro-Shara, from what I understand.
They are, and they've made a point of bringing a number of delegations of Syrian Jews over. I think Shara has a few advisors who are very savvy on this point, and they know that almost nothing could play better in America than the leader welcoming Jews, to visit their old home. But there's I don't know if there's a handful of old men and women left, but there's no community there. And
they were mostly in Aleppo and Damascus, I imagine, right?
Yeah. I went to school with a lot of Syrian Jews.
Really?
They they certainly didn't talk about going back. I'd be interested. But and there's even people, and I heard this, I addressed a group of rabbis several months ago. One of them came up to me and just said, you're harsh on Ashara. It's like, he's with us against the Iranians. That's what really matters. I don't care if he was al-Qaeda or Islamic State. And, to my mind, that's not a risk you really want to take. The al-Qaeda Islamic State guys, you remember what they do. But there is this opening.
What's going on in Congress on this? There's talk about getting rid of sanctions. There are some sanctions that still in place, right? Seizure sanctions?
Right. So there's the distinction between, the actual designations of this guy's bad, that guy's bad, he's under sanctions, or this government agency, versus the underlying statute that makes those things possible. So Trump, committed to lifting sanctions. He basically took off just about everything except for a thing on figures from the Assad regime who are still out there, right? So, you don't take the sanctions off Bashar al-Assad.
And Trump could do it without congressional approval, or he had congressional approval? It depends on what kind of sanctions.
Right, but in most cases, there are certain sanctions where Congress has now built in sort of mechanisms where they need to approve.
I think the seizure sanctions are such.
Yes.
But I think that was
Well, there's certainly statutory sanctions.
Okay, that's what I mean. Okay.
He can, so he can't.
He can waive,
yeah,
but not really move.
Yes, he can waive.
Right.
And so one of the things is that really one of the absolute biggest supporters of tough sanctions on Syria, Congressman Joe Wilson, a Republican, has flipped entirely to being pro-Shara and believes, wants everything off fast. And it's also, I'd say, the organs representing the Syrian American community feel the same way.
Okay.
And to my mind, and to sort of introduce a bit of a new topic, right? We've sort of had this debate, Shara sort of pragmatic foreign, has these massacres, it's a problem locally. But there's another element. We're not talking as much about democracy, right? So a lot of the people in this country, Syrian Americans and others who opposed Assad, were like, what we want for Syria is not just anything but Assad. We actually want freedom, so people could speak their mind. And Shara is not. Shara is building an authoritarian state. That doesn't go commented on a lot because we're mostly out of the business in a way of democracy promotion, and we don't feel like we're going to hit him hard because how do we tell this guy you need to have a more liberal system when none of your neighbors have it except Israel?
Well, I mean, by the way, here's what I would say, and this is my view. I think it's a view of a number of us at FDD. It doesn't have to be everybody's view, and that it would be, democracy is wonderful, but failing that, you can still have respect for human rights. There are no democratic Arab societies, and there are very few Muslim majority societies that are democratic. But can you have guarantees of basic fundamental human rights, the rule of law, minority protections, some freedom of speech, maybe within an authoritarian? I mean, you can, and we've always known this. I mean, what's Singapore been all this time? I mean, it's not a democracy, is it? It's a decent society.
If there was a Lee Kuan Yew that we could get along with his cabinet members, right? But the problem is when a lack of democracy in Syria means Shara putting his jihadist comrades into all the key positions with no oversight. So he set up a system. He's appointing judges. He gets to appoint a third of the legislators, and the others are influenced by him. And this means that one of the very first things he did was put the security services under control of his closest compatriots. Right. So. And, that should phase out. If you actually have anything like democracy, other organs need to say who's running the security services.
But in a country like Syria, where you have these very different populations, very hard, not impossible, but to imagine, but to realize, where if you're Druze, you vote for somebody who is Sunni, where if you are Alawite, you vote for a Christian, you're going to vote for your community. So to have, and now again, I'm not saying people in the United States, a lot of people vote on the basis of ethnicity or race, but not everybody does. Plenty of people don't, right? Plenty of people, there are plenty of black conservatives who weren't going to vote for Kamala Harris, right? So it's possible to do, but it takes a certain level of maturity not to vote outside your community, because at that point you have to say, I see myself essentially as a Syrian, a Syrian of Druze extraction, of Christians.
I would say even if they voted as blocks, it could be a little more of a balance of power.
Well, it was kind of tried in Lebanon, and so far, at least, it hasn't.
I'm not going to hold up Lebanon as a model.
But that was the idea, wasn't it?
It was.
For a long time, and it's kind of failed. Maybe it can still succeed. A lot of people hope it can, especially if Hezbollah is put down, because what has Hezbollah been in Lebanon? It has been a political faction that is better armed than the country is. That is problematic within a democratic society, right?
Right. But I'd say there is a direct link between these atrocities we're seeing and the lack of any kind of oversight or separation of powers, right? It is some of the same guys who the Biden administration actually sanctioned them, rightly so, for their human rights abuses against Kurds. And then they went and played a key role in the massacre of Alawites. Mm-hmm. And there's no one to challenge Shara for having them as generals in his army and their troops under them and brigades, because he set up a system where he's beyond reproach.
Right. All right. In the last few minutes we have, what haven't we discussed about Syria that people should understand that is important that we just haven't gotten to because I forgot to ask about it?
Well, one is the extent to which Iran has lost his influence. I mean, you've obviously made the point a few times that Assad, although not theologically inclined to anything Iran believed, was, really, he and his father, really dating from the late 70s, were, 79 when Khomeini took over, were in lockstep with Iran, really the whole way through.
Right. One of the proxies, part of the Ring of Fire, part of the what I would call the Khomeinist empire.
Yeah. And it's a big deal that he's gone. And, there are apparently some weapons getting through still to Hezbollah that come from the east, but it's a big blow. There's Shara seems to have not surprisingly, a loathing for the Iranians, who of course participated in all the massacres of the Assad years.
Yeah.
So in that sense, he has a joint interest with Israel. They both want to keep Iran far away. He may be a courtier, he may be courted by everyone, but I don't think we're seeing too much courting from Iran.
What about, this is something you've written and talked about, drugs, Captagon. Syria was a Captagon factory, right?
Absolutely.
Where's that?
Shara claimed yesterday that 90% of Captagon production or drug production has been eliminated. In Syria. I don't necessarily agree with that number. We're seeing a lot of...
It's exaggerated maybe, but yeah.
We're seeing a lot of interceptions in Jordan, which was one of the corridors that the Syrians have used previously. We're seeing more interceptions in the Gulf. That was a top destination for Captagon smuggling. Now, he may have stopped the production facilities. These were all either managed by members of what was called back then the 4th Armored Division, which was linked to Bashar al-Assad's brother, Maher al-Assad, and other Iranian proxies. But at the same time, there's still Captagon production facilities in Lebanon, and the border between Lebanon and Syria is not secured fully. And that's another discussion because the Lebanese and the Syrians are trying to demark the border, and there's a lot of negotiations about that. And then there's a Hezbollah element to it, which still maintains a very small presence on the Syrian-Lebanese border. And so that's been an issue. Now, what complicates this even more is that southern Syria, so the area which includes Suwaida and Daraa, and where Israel has its
Daraa
troops,
being another province, the one closest to it's closest on the border of Jordan, right?
Yes, it borders Jordan. So there's basically no government control over there. It's run by militias and tribes, and they've taken advantage of that, of the lack of security and the security gap in order to increase their smuggling attempts into Jordan. Another issue, and back to the Iran issue, is that in southern Syria there's also remnants of Iran's proxy network. And Israel has been acting against these militias and individuals linked to these militias over the past 2 months. Individuals who are linked to the Quds Force, the IRGC's Quds Force,
right,
as well as Hamas. So this only makes it essential that a security deal should be signed between Israel and Syria to govern southern Syria and to at least fill this void that has been created after December 2024.
And I should know, is Captagon mostly consumed in the Middle East, or is Europe or even America?
I believe it has reached some areas in Europe, but it's mainly in the Middle East.
Really in the Gulf, yeah.
In the Gulf, yeah.
It's amphetamine-like.
Yeah,
amphetamine.
No longer. There originally was a drug, you called Captagon, but it's mostly been denatured now. It's not a sort of authentic.
Captain.
So please don't buy any.
No.
Yeah.
But
I'll just chew my cot. That's
I mean, the Saudis have been I mean, helping out al-Sharaa this was one of their priorities also, to stop Captagon smuggling into Saudi Arabia, because that was a top destination during Assad's days.
All right. Very interesting discussion. I've learned a lot. I hope our listeners too. Ahmad, thank you very much. David, thank you very much.
Of course.
Thanks to all of you who have been with us for this conversation here today on Foreign Policy.